Dr. Heidegger's experiment is a short story, and here are the main characters of that story. So, the first one is Dr. Heidegger, a scientific experimenter who invites his old friends to participate in an experiment with water from the fountain of youth. So, the next one is Mr. Medbourne. He is an elderly man who is bankrupt and hopes that the water will restore his lost wealth. So, the next one, or the third one, is Mr. Colonel Killigrew, an elderly man who is a former soldier and womanizer, and hopes that the water will restore his lost youth and vigor. So the next one is Mr. Gascoigne. So he is an elderly man who is a former politician and hopes that the water will restore his lost influence and power. And last but not least, the only female in the main characters is the widow Wincherly. So she is an elderly woman who was once a great beauty and hopes that the water will restore her lost youth and the beauty, of course. So all of the characters are old and dissatisfied with their current lives. So they hope that the water will give them a second chance at youth and happiness. So however, the experiment does not go as planned, and the characters continues to find where this will be found, this fountain of youth. And instead of learning their lesson after they took that water, they did not learn their lesson. Instead, they started to find it and waste their time in Florida in order to find that magical water.
The story highlights the inability of humans to resist their base desires, even when presented with newfound wisdom and insight. Additionally, the story explores the idea that the pursuit of youth and immortality can ultimately lead to downfall and destruction. Throughout the story, the characters struggle with their own personal flaws and the temptations. The four elderly guests are initially excited to participate in the experiment and hope to regain their lost youth. But they soon give in to their old vices and sins. Mr. Midborn became greedy and covets his gold coins. Colonel Killigrew drinks excessively. Mr. Gascoigne becomes obsessed with his political career, and the widow Wycherley becomes vain and desires the admiration of men. So the story suggests that even with the opportunity to regain their youth, the characters are unable to escape their own flawed nature. Dr. Heidegger's Experiment is a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne, first published in 1837. So the story is about an old doctor named Heidegger, who invites four of his aged friends to his study to participate in an experiment. So the four friends are Mr. Medbourne, Colonel Killigrew, Mr. Gascoigne, and widow Wycherley, who are all wealthy and had lived dissolute lives. Heidegger presents them with a vase filled with water from the legendary fountain of youth. He tells them that the water has the power to restore their youth, and that he wants to observe their behavior once they have regained their youth. So, the four friends drink from the vase, and they immediately feel younger and more energetic. They begin to act like they did when they were young, and they indulge in their old vices. However, they soon realize that they have not learned from their past mistakes, and their behavior leads to chaos. Well, Eventually, the vase is knocked over and the water spills, and the four friends revert to their old age. After that, Heidegger tells them that the experiment was a success, as it showed that they had not learned from their past experiences and had repeated the same mistakes. The story ends with Heidegger warning them that the effects of the water were only temporary and that they should learn from their past experiences and not waste the time they have left in their lives.
The story is entitled Dr. Heidegger Experiment. The short story of Dr. Heidegger Experiment is written by the American author Nathaniel Hawthorne. It was first published anonymously in 1837. Dr. Heidegger Experiment of Nathaniel Hawthorne brings together two themes that appear in his works: hubris of science and the idea of internal youth. Dr. Heidegger used science to see if four of his guests will do the same mistake the second time around. But because they do the same thing, it became overambitious, arrogance, overconfidence, and pride, which signifies hubris. In Dr. Heidegger Experiment, youth is used as a metaphor to represent psychological growth, recklessness, and human nature. Nathaniel Hawthorne is trying to show in this story that mistakes are inherently associated with youth, and that even if we could go back in time, one would be very prone in making the same mistakes. Hawthorne described the settings in Dr. Heidegger Experiment as a dim, old-fashioned chamber, festooned with cobwebs and besprinkled with antique dust. This story demonstrates a Gothic scene through the darkness of a dim lights and the dirtiness of his chamber.
Psychological analysis for Dr. Heidegger's experiment story. So, Dr. Heidegger's experiment is a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne that explores the theme of morality, youth, and the dangers of excess. The story follows Dr. Heidegger, an elderly physician who invites four old friends to his study to participate in an experiment involving the fountain of youth. So, there is a psychological analysis of the characters in the story. So the first one is Dr. Heidegger. He is an elderly physician who is disillusioned with the world and believes that he has wasted his life. So he is motivated to prove something and that he can have his popularity despite his age due to his experiments and inventions. So he was willing to risk lives just like how the laboratory was described in the story, the skull, and other elements that prove that his place was really horrifying and terrifying. So the next characters are the four old friends. So they are all past their prime and have lived full lives, but they are dissatisfied with their current situation. So they are motivated by a desire to recapture their youth and are willing to risk their own lives to achieve this goal. So, based on the story, their behavior was seen as a manifestation of their fear of death and their desire to avoid the inevitable. So, also in the story, malignancy from from their young age was seen to their future self, as the author foreshadowed their greediness and insatiability. These four characters remains to be the same as if they haven't learned anything from their past. So I just summarized the four problems with regards to their behaviors and their mental thinking. So the next one is the rose. So what does it signify in psychology? So the rose that Dr. Heidegger uses in experiment can be seen as a symbol of youth and beauty. It presents the character's desire to recapture their lost youth and is a physical manifestation of their desire to avoid the inevitable. So the rose was also a memory of Dr. Heidegger's wife, which is Miss Sylvia, and as he kept everything inside when no one can touch it or mess with it. So it is the only memory that the Dr. Heideggers have from his wife. So the next object we see the water from the fountain of youth. So the water represents the character's desire to avoid the inevitable, just like the rose, and recapture their lost youth. It is also a symbol of the dangers of excess and the consequences of trying to hold onto something that cannot be regained. So the water served as the chance or the opportunity to go back again from their past. And whenever the four knew about this, they decided to take more and more so that they can go back. So another one is there was also part in the story that tells about the reflection in the mirror of these four friends that are under an experiment. So their reflection was still old and prickly, just like a common image of an old person, even though they already drank a water from the fountain of youth. So in this, the theory arises as maybe it's not really a magical water, but an experiment that made people hallucinate and achieve what they want to achieve. So the mirror was the reflection of truth, despite of any delusions they believe due to that potion. So behind that water, maybe it's not really a fountain of youth, but an experiment that created by Dr. Heidegger. So the last one is the overall of the story can be interpreted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of excess and the importance of accepting the inevitable. The characters' desire to recapture their lost youth is driven by their fear of death and their unwillingness to accept the reality of aging. So, however, their attempts to avoid the inevitable only lead to further disillusionment and disappointment. So the story suggests that it is better to accept the reality of aging and make the most of the time that we have rather than trying to recapture something that is ultimately and unattainable. So that's how the story must work. We must learn from the past, we must enjoy our time so that we will not have any regrets or unfortunately forgot to do in our lives. There are dreams and passions that we want to pursue, and as long as we are not hurting someone or influencing bad ideas or bad behaviors to other people, let's just pursue what we want so that we will not have regrets in the future. So that's the psychological analysis for the Dr. Heidegger's experiment.
So next is the feminist approach. So Widow Shirley is a beautiful woman when she was still young, and the reason why Mr. Medbourne, Cornell Calligrew, and Mr. Gascoigne almost killed each other for her sake. She still chooses to ruin her reputation, perhaps to be attractive with men and be eager to get her. And because Widow Shirley ruined her reputation and dignity in a lot of scandalous stories about her, she had lived in a deep seclusion and became alone and far away from her hometown. She represents herself as a woman who lived with pride and ego, knowing that all men will be obsessed with her beauty. It is shown in the story that after drinking the water of youth, Widow Shirley becomes once again a beautiful lady, but then she didn't know the word humbleness, but she still had an excessive pride in her own appearance. With that, her beauty encourages and gets the attention of the three gentlemen to fight over her again, the same on what happened when they were still young. She never used to believe that her beauty will never last, but it will fade as time goes by. What will matter is the character itself, because the inner beauty lives forever. Widow Shirley lived in a life with feminine vanity.
So this is the historical and biographical approach. So Dr. Heidegger's experiment is written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So Nathaniel Hawthorne is born in July 4, 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts, where one of his ancestors had acted as a judge during the infamous Salem witch trials in the late 17th century. So, Hawthorne's father is a sea captain that died when when Hawthorne was 4 years old, and he was raised by his mother and her family. So Hawthorne is known for short stories and novels that examine the relationships between the visible physical world of nature and invisible spiritual life of human beings. So Dr. Heidegger's experiment was written by Nathaniel Hawthorne and first published in 1837 as a short story. The story is a cautionary tale about the perils of pursuing eternal youth and beauty, and it reflects some of the Hawthorne's major themes and concerns as a writer. Hawthorne was known for his fascination with the darker aspect of human nature, such as the capacity for greed, ambition, and selfishness. He explores these themes in Dr. Heidegger's experiment by telling the story of an eccentric scientist who invites a group of old friends to participate in an experiment to restore their youth and beauty, or a vitality. The experiment eventually fails, and the characters are forced to face the consequences of their desire to avoid death. So, the story can be interpreted as an allegory about the perils of scientific experimentation of the human desire for eternal life. It's also a cautionary tale about the dangers of dwelling on the past and refusing to let go the past mistakes and regrets. So, overall, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote the Dr. Heidegger's experiment to investigate the darker aspect of human nature and to warn his reader about the dangers of pursuing the eternal youth and beauty. Also, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote Dr. Heidegger's experiment to know how people didn't learn or learned from their mistake.
And our last approach is a moral philosophical approach. There are different ways to appreciate a story like Hawthorne's Dr. Heidegger's experiments. It is often read as a story about growing old gracefully. The story from American author Nathaniel Hawthorne demonstrates the value of time, chances, and acceptance. When the time Dr. Heidegger gives time to his friends to change their past, the friends did not value the time, but then repeat their mistake, and even worse, chances. When the time gives us opportunities, don't take them for granted, because not all the time we get a chance to change our lives. And the acceptance that physical beauty fades. Just like philosophy of Heraclitus, changes is the only constant in life. So, the story also teaches the moral that being too much is not good. That tragedy brought sins. Due to carelessness of Dr. Heidegger's friend, water of youth fell on ground, and because they wanted to be young again, they looked for fountain of youth that Dr. Heidegger used on the experiment. Furthermore, the story also teaches us that privilege imposes responsibility. If you don't take the responsibility, you will lose the privilege. And if you take privilege, it comes with responsibility.